welcome to the session. Really happy and glad to have you here. If you're new to Crowdcast, this platform we're on, then on the right-hand side, you're going to see a few options. You're going to see a chat to put messages that for everybody here, a Q&A section for your questions, and maybe even later we'll get into some polls. Really quick, Rin-rin, thank you. Like I was just talking for 3 minutes with no clue. But again, thanks everybody. Today is all about how to get internal buy-in for your podcast, specifically within a university higher ed context. So just to get started here with the introductions, my name is Robert Lee. I am the co-founder and owner of University FM, the higher ed podcast agency. We partner with universities and colleges to help them produce podcasts, get it out into the world with distribution, and for some shows, monetization. On the screen here, you'll see a podcast called The Word on Campus that we just launched. It's all about other podcasts. So it's a podcast about podcasts, specifically taking a behind-the-scenes look at how some of the best university podcasts get made with those university producers and hosts, etc. And with me today is Rin-rin from Howard University. And Rin-rin, I'll let you say hello.
Hi, everyone. Happy Friday. I'm glad that you can hear me. You can hear me, right?
Yes.
Okay.
So Rin-rin, you want to briefly introduce yourself and also talk a little bit about this show right here?
Sure. So I'm the editor-chief at Howard University. I manage the magazine, our website, a few other editorial projects, and most recently our podcast, which we've named From HU to You, which we recorded earlier and are just starting to release now. And it's been very exciting and a lot of fun and created a ton of buzz on campus and beyond.
Awesome. So as we kind of go through this session, we're going to be using, From HU to You as the example, and we're just going to talk about the process from her perspective on how she got buy-in and how the podcast got started. So as we go along, definitely this is interactive, so feel free to put your questions or comments. Also, we're gonna have a small group today, so happy to even talk about things specific to your university or college. All right. To get started, we're providing a takeaway doc on podcast buy-in strategy. So in the second here, I'm going to put a link in the chat for everybody. It's going to direct you to a Google Doc where you can make a copy for yourself. And as we go along today, you can add comments as ideas kind of pop in mind. So it's structured exactly, matching the agenda of the day. So let me go ahead and share that. You're gonna see my screen here really quick. All right, so let me do this. All right, so there's the document. And today we are going to be covering 3 things. How we structured this is thinking at a very high level, the top questions that people ask internally within an institution. Why should we have a podcast? If we're going to have a podcast, what are the potential hurdles that we need to overcome? And then, at the end of the day, what makes the podcast successful? How can we be confident that the podcast is a worthwhile investment of our time and resources? So you see here, we're going to dive into tying a podcast with your existing communication strategy, talking about common reasons podcasts don't get started and how to avoid those situations, and then defining success and what that means for your podcast in the context of your communication strategy and your team. So to start, why have a podcast? On the top here are a few reasons. Podcasts provide people an opportunity to hear from others directly. Those could be your professors, your students, your other faculty members, even people from staff and leadership, like your president. It allows you to reach people who take information in different ways. Some people prefer videos, some people prefer reading, others prefer or learn the best from listening. And of course, what comes with that is the accessibility that podcasts provide in terms of being able to listen to something, by itself or while you're doing some other activity, like maybe taking a walk, or doing dishes, things like that. And the last point here that I really want to emphasize is communicating authentically. We all understand that in communication strategy, it is oftentimes most effective when it's perceived as being authentic. And podcasts with the medium, provide kind of a natural way for in the conversation process for people to dig deeper into topics and dig deeper into the whys. So Rin-rin, I'll let you share a few notes from your end about Howard.
Yeah, so we knew podcasts were very popular. People like to listen to them in the car while they're out running or whatever. It wasn't hard to convince people to have one. And like you said, because we already had a magazine, we had it in print, we had it in digital, we started with video, and we were just missing that audio component. And one thing I actually found when we were interviewing people, when we were talking with people and recording our podcast, is that they don't have the pressure of having the video on them. So they actually can relax a little bit, which then talks, we were talking about communicating authentically. People can actually be themselves and talk about what they know. And these people know a lot. So it's really a great way to share their knowledge and their expertise in a much more relaxed setting. And it's kind of like you're eavesdropping on this conversation that's going on. So far it's gotten just some really great, people are just really excited about it. And so we've been excited too, that people are excited about it as well.
Is there any specific example that comes to mind, Rin, about for a specific episode where the guest was really allowed to be authentic and kind of got deep into their why?
Yeah, I mean, I think every one of them actually has that. So we had there was like a business professor who she was a little nervous when she first came in. And we actually we're not as familiar with her as a person, but once you get them talking about just what they're doing. So she was talking about when she was younger and working in the finance industry and being kind of discriminated against for being a Black woman. So you've got like being Black and you've got being woman. So then she was able to kind of go more deeply and, you could ask more questions about it. And she would tell these stories about how, she was told to go home and change her hair. She had one of her subordinates was like, oh, you should be a secretary. I mean, these are really great stories to hear from the voice of the person that experienced it. So, that was really great.
Yeah, and so just to piggyback on that, you mentioned the story element. And so part of this can be kind of authentically, I think something that comes out is, podcasts, yes, they are a way to share information, but they're not the same as like a PSA announcement, right? And that story piece really just brings to life the work and the activities that are happening on campus.
Yes, for sure.
All right. So there's a high level, when you hear somebody say, okay, yeah, I want to do a podcast, usually one of these three reasons are in there, and then definitely there's more. When we talk about strategy impact now, I want to focus on the bottom right-hand corner of what I'm presenting. So in our work, with say Howard University and with other institutions, there's different types of podcast shows. There's shows that are focused on professors, where professors are the hosts, shows with the president as a host, research podcasts, student podcasts, alumni podcasts, and each of these podcasts kind of has different goals. Depending on who is making the show and who it's for, it's communicating slightly different aspects. So, for example, professor podcasts, for professors, podcasts are a really great way, or they see as a great way to get their research out there and impact the world outside of their campus and build up their influence and personal branding. For presidents, oftentimes they look at podcasts as a way to connect directly with their own community and to share how they think about things and their own beliefs. Student podcasts, sometimes that's all about giving students a learning opportunity with making their own show. Alumni podcasts, at times that's about donor cultivation or alumni engagement, keeping people involved, research podcasts, and etc. So, so on the left-hand side, also listed a few high-level, ways that podcasts can impact communication strategy. And then, Rin-rin, I'd love for you to share a bit about, the thought process about why you guys want to do a Howard podcast, and what kind of, I guess, impact you want it to have.
Okay, so Howard University is a little bit unique because we are an HBCU. And we're one of the leading HBCUs, and a lot of the Black community in particular looks to Howard for to verify and to basically be a source of truth and trust. And so we knew that if we launched a podcast, it would go beyond the university, whether we wanted it to or not. So we had to definitely keep that audience in mind. And we did want to reach other people. Obviously, you're talking about having that reach beyond the institution. So we knew that would automatically happen. And it is a really great opportunity to showcase all those subject matter experts that we have on campus who may not necessarily have the outlets sometimes to be heard. So obviously we talk a lot about social justice issues, things that affect the Black community, but then we also have the opportunity to say, hey, our math department here, or, our biology scholars or whoever, and show, we have subject matter experts in these areas as well. So for example, we did one about statistics because we have actually several statistics programs, and we just launched a master's in data science. And part of it is because 3% of all statisticians and data scientists nationwide are Black. And I mean, that's not a very high number. So not only are we talking about, are we getting perspective from Howard that we do have statisticians, and there's a whole bunch of them here, but it might encourage other people who are listening who don't go to Howard, who maybe like, hey, actually, that sounds like a really interesting field. I may want to enter it. Let me learn more. And here are people who are like me who are in this field. So I think that's also really important. And so that was a really great opportunity to be able to bring someone on who normally is probably very quiet, just crunching his numbers all day, but we got him on and he was talking about, what they're doing, what he's doing, what his interests are for the university and all that. So I think was really, that was a really great one. Another example was we invited 2 people from the Afro-Latino community, because they are another group who often feels a little bit torn between, are they Latin or are they African American? And often they're both. And so their whole thing is they don't like to be feeling torn. They want to be one community, but they really embrace their diversity. And so they want more of a voice. And so we gave them more of that voice. And it was a really great conversation and opportunity to show just, how diverse really the Black community is. And so then they were able to talk about not only just issues, but also the fun things that they do on campus and the events, and all the different cultural differences and, highlights that they have.
Yeah, so a few pieces there, right? It sounds like the podcast provide an opportunity to give more members of the community a voice, and it also serves as a way to talk about all this huge variety of things going on campus, but in a broader, national and international context. And I'm excited. We just launched the first episode, right, just a few weeks ago, so more to come, for this season and next season.
Oh yeah, I mean, we've got a lot of people who are just like, oh, that's a really great idea. We want to be on here now too. And so, we have had no shortage of buy-in and acceptance and ideas rolling in. So it's great. People want to be heard. People have really interesting topics to talk about. It's sort of an endless stream. And it's nice because we really will be able to give a lot of opportunity. We're not restricted by page count in this case for like the magazine, but it's a nice opportunity to be able to have that conversation with people, and we might even branch out more and do more not just conversations, but maybe do more like show like pieces. We haven't quite gotten there yet, but it's a
Yeah.
plan.
Well, I mean, that's a good tie into the next part here. We're going to talk about a little bit about the planning process. Um, but we want to, highlight what are some potential hurdles, some of the common reasons podcasts don't get started. There's four buckets here that, and there's a few other smaller ones, but these are the ones that come up most often. So budgeting, the physical space, equipment requirements, team staffing, and defining process for production and distribution, and the time to plan content and stories. I'll just kick it off by talking about budgeting and physical space slash equipment. So from a budgeting perspective, I always get this question, right? Like how much will it cost? And what would the cost be like if you were to outsource to somebody or do everything in house? I think the very first place to start when you're thinking about budget is what is the structure of the show? Because when you think about a show in terms of a interview structure versus a narrative structure, there's a huge difference in the amount of prep work that goes into it and the post-production and the number of people involved. So an example of a narrative podcast would be, at the very top, it would be like This American Life or like a 99% Invisible, where each episode takes a minimum a month to make, and teams go all the way up to 10 plus, right? And then on the other end of the spectrum, you might have a grassroots like student initiative where just they're recording on their iPhone, and it's really a team of one or two put together. So show concept structures is really important to understand first in order to realize the impact on budget. With that, publishing frequency, is it going to be every 2 weeks, every week, once a month? And then there is an option here, of course, for some shows as they grow for sponsorships and eventually building up like a self-funding model. So these are kind of the things to think about when you build out a budget range, right? Budget estimate range. Physical space and equipment. So, the big question here is, are most interviews going to be done remote or in person? If it's remote, then hey, you can have a pretty good setup for up to $400, where you might just be in your office or at home interviewing other folks. If it's in person, that provides some creativity and okay, could we use or partner with the radio station we have on campus or different recording spaces? So there's a few ways to also leverage what you currently have. Team staffing and then time plan. So, there's a difference between 10 and 1 versus 10. I've seen it work both ways, depending on the structure of the show. And then there's an opportunity to involve other departments, maybe. That's consideration for content strategy, and maybe tapping into resources that you don't have in your own department. And then there's options to engage other people, engage students, alumni, faculty. And then the last one here, time to plan content and stories. We always recommend starting with bulk recording. Okay, in order to not be caught in a crunch mode, bulk record 3 or 4 episodes up front and get those produced before we actually launch the season or the first episode. And then thinking about the timeline, what milestones are currently happening already for the communication strategy, and how can you tie the podcast as a part of that? So sometimes that might mean tying to homecoming or a magazine launch, but really making that planning more aligned. So Rin-rin, I'm going to let you give or talk about the Howard experience for the team staffing and processes, and then kind of your approach to planning content.
So we need more staff for sure. So it was me and my VP who were doing the bulk of the planning. This was just to launch it basically off the ground. So we had taken stories that had already appeared on the website and our magazine, and we would expand on them. So we would find the guests and invite them on to talk. But it still required, writing an intro, an outro, doing the research, finding the statistics and all that, and writing the questions and then prepping the person and inviting the person and scheduling them. So we that was it was a lot of time, but it was basically we planned we were just going to take like a block of I think 2 or 3 weeks to get it all done. So when we talk about bulk recording, that was actually really great. And actually, he was on his way out to work for another university, so we were on a definite time crunch, but we managed to get them all done. But it takes time, and I think going forward, we would probably need someone who is part of their job is completely dedicated to planning out these podcasts, or you can split it up. Because right now, what we're doing is it's like I'll take on a few, my associate editor will take on a few, and maybe some other volunteers. However, so now that our host, who was our VP, has left, we haven't had a main host, but that's actually been okay because I kind of like the idea of giving other people around the university an opportunity to host and be guests. So, it's a lot more voices. You can get 2 voices in one. And there are a lot of people who've been coming up to me and saying, I would love to do this podcast. And I was like, do you want to also be the host? And they're like, yeah, great. And it actually works out well because they're also the subject matter expert in the idea that they have pitched. So in some ways, they actually probably would have the knowledge and the statistics and whatever information they have up front already, so that someone like me wouldn't have to go digging around trying to find that information. And I just feel like if it's their passion on this particular topic, they would kind of convey that through as a host. So, we've got just people, faculty, staff, just all around university have expressed interest. So then really it's just about blocking their time off, getting them to sit down and, working with them to get it set up and written and all that. So, and then recorded, but then, once you get that done, then it's a great product that comes out afterwards. And then the other thing we're trying to do is we also try to line it up with certain events through the year. So it actually timed out really well when we did the Afro-Latino story, that it came out around the Hispanic Heritage Month. So that worked out well. So you just kind of have to plan the time around that too, because people are very busy.
Yeah. And I could just use Howard as an example for these other 2 aspects. So the equipment, we did consider, right, possibly using the radio station studio, but ended up just getting, these kits that were up to $400 for each person being recorded. And I think you guys just did it in the offices, right?
Yeah, I mean, we did it. We did it in our VP's office, which is kind of a large space. It's not the most ideal, but I think it turned out okay. And we actually are moving into a new building next year where we had purposely planned for a studio. But if we were to want a studio, I think we could have built out, something with some styrofoam and whatever. Mostly it's just you don't want interruptions or outside noise or things like phones ringing, emails dinging in the background and on the computer, things like that. So I think it's just that part of it is really just coordinating the time with that person to make sure that everyone understands you need this hour uninterrupted. Also, so people can focus on what they're talking about.
Right. And then just going back to this budgeting point, then we did plan a bi-weekly, so every 2 weeks publishing frequency. Mm-hmm. And then we have season 1 for the fall and roughly season 2 for the winter.
Yeah. And in an ideal world, it would end up being weekly. So we're ramping up to that. So that would be great if we could get to that.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Thanks, Rin-rin. Let's keep on going. So last part here. What makes a podcast successful? I want to talk first about defining your goals. And usually when I ask people for their goals, the first idea that comes to mind is a certain downloads number. I always push people to think, is our downloads actually the most important metric you want to measure? So some other examples here are like listening through rate. How much of an episode do people actually get through? Did they get through only 20% of it and then drop off, or they get through like 80%? And actually, for an episode, say that's about 30 minutes, that's about 25 minutes, right? 25 plus. Ratings, reviews. What is the qualitative feedback that people are giving us? And do people really enjoy it from like stars of one through five? Donor cultivation, right? Is the podcast meant maybe more as a tool for engaging potential donors? Student involvement, or is the podcast more of a tool for providing students a learning opportunity? Admissions podcasts. Are we measuring inquiries more? That come in from the podcast. This last one's a little different, consistency, which is, as we first start out with a new show, maybe the first goal is making sure that we can keep up with a publishing frequency, and to consistently publish at a high quality, right? Because definitely in the podcast world, when you think about listenership growth, number of subscribers, that all happens over a long period of time, and listeners need to be able to expect, right, and kind of build excitement for when new episodes are coming out. So the first point here, define your goals. Yes, downloads are always going to be a part of the conversation, but is there something that that is above that? Benchmarking against other peers. So these stats here are coming from a podcast hosting tool called Buzzsprout, and this is publicly available data. So basically, what they've done is, of all the shows that are hosted on Buzzsprout, which I believe they're definitely 500,000 plus, what are the stats? So first box here is around episode downloads in the first 7 days. This means the first 7 days after publishing. Then you have episode duration, and then you have the publishing frequency. So just to give a sense of numbers, right? When you look at the average, or the top 50%, they get about 30 downloads in the first 7 days. I've seen recent stats that if this is extrapolated out to 30 days, it's about 130. So in the first 30 days, under 30 for average. Episode duration, majority of podcasts land within this 20 to 40 minute range, which makes sense, right? If you're thinking about commute times, I mean, that's actually what a lot of it was initially based off of, commute times. But when I look at the spread, it's relatively even across the less than 10, 20, 40, 60, and 60 and above. So to me, it's, take this with a grain of salt. The episode duration really depends on your understanding of your audience's listening habits. Because I've definitely seen shows that do well, less than 10, more like news oriented, and then shows over 60, maybe more, research heavy, or more, a deeper dive into specific research in relation to current events. So any of these durations could work, just depends on the understanding of your audience. And then this publishing frequency, every 2 weeks is the most frequent here, this, or weekly, being the second most frequent. And that's pretty consistent with our experience and seeing, okay, shows that do monthly publishing, so over that 30 days, they don't really do so well in terms of building up audiences. Last point here on the data-driven approach. So, there's podcast stats, the stats that come directly from the listening platforms, say your Apple Podcasts or your Spotify, and then there's the qualitative feedback that comes from reviews and from listener surveys. So the point I want to drive home here is that when you think about what makes a podcast successful and we want to measure, there's a few ways to measure. Podcast stats at base level, you're definitely going to see your down numbers, your number of subscribers, your listen through rates. some demographic data like age group and geography. If you go a step further, then you can also tie podcast performance to, say, social media engagement related to the podcast. And then from a qualitative feedback side, yes, reviews, and definitely, over time, considering and building a listener survey to dig deeper into, okay, listener behavior with questions like, what other shows do you listen to? When do you usually listen to our show? Are you doing something else while listening to our show? And all of those kind of feed into how you refine your podcast structure and kind of refine the topics that you're covering and the stories that you're covering. Rin-rin, I want to bring you in on here. So just starting at the very first point, could you talk a little bit about like what goals we set out with from issue to you?
So like you, we didn't want to just go based on downloads or, to measure. I think for us, part of it was, yes, we got the administrative buy-in, but we needed campus buy-in. And so even without releasing a podcast, I think that was really enthusiastic. So I feel like that success it's not just like this shiny new object that we've got in the university. This is something that, and so if we have this enthusiasm, we want to maintain it. So that I think was part of our success, was getting that. And the next is yes, I mean, we want to look at how many people are listening, how long they're listening for, but also I think the reach and the demographics are kind of important to us, because we want to know that we're reaching a large group of people. And we want to know that we're reaching people in other parts of the country. So that means it's not just restricted to the DC area where Howard is located. So it's not just like the staff, faculty listening. We actually know that alumni and community and their families and friends are also tuning in. So and if we can go internationally, that would be even better if they have access to it. So yeah, I think a lot of those measures, and then also I think just the feedback in general we hear on social media, just anecdotal data is always kind of a little more qualitative. I feel like when people say, "Oh, that was really an interesting discussion," I want to know that they're having these conversations in the background too.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
we can also get and if we can also get like other media places, that is actually how we measure something in our magazine. Is you can look at, okay, we got this many hits on a story, but then if the media is starting to pick it up, which they have. And next thing you know, like Sports Illustrated is putting our the same story we just did, but they just copied it and put it on the cover. We know we've really made an impact there, and that we spread our message further. And if they're starting to call our subject matter experts up and starting to interview them for the media, I think that's a really good reach too.
Yeah, yeah. And yes, part of the qualitative side, just wanted to highlight that again, right? It's just be able to the community be able to say like, okay, great, like these conversations are happening, right? And kind of giving that exposure to different groups on within campus community and beyond.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so those were the three things we covered. I wanted to come back here. Why have a podcast? What are the hurdles? What makes a podcast successful? These are the most frequent questions that people first get when they pitch a show idea or just start that conversation. And I hope with some of the information that we just went through and using some examples from Howard, you're able to kind of get an idea or spark some new ideas in your mind about how to convey the value of podcasts to others on your team. Rin-rin, is there anything else you want to add?
No, I think it's just something that people should always experiment. Don't be afraid to change direction. I think it's been a lot of fun to have, and I think it can only grow. I think it's important to make sure you have a steady, consistent stream of ideas coming through, because it is easy to be like, oh, we want a podcast. Why? Because it's a fun, shiny thing to have. No, you need more of a reason for that, and you need to have that energy to continue going through. But And part of the energy is just having that flexibility to know that things might change, people might change, but I think it's really fun to experiment with, and we've had a good time.
Okay, thanks, Rin-rin. So
Welcome.
just end it here. Here's our contact information. If you have any questions or just want to bounce ideas, I am happy to talk. And I just put Rin-rin's email here too for anything specific from HU to you. And last comment here, there's some additional resources for higher ed or education podcasting. First, this is the first of our how-to podcast series. So today's about how to get buy-in, and in the future, we're going to be talking about podcast planning flow, the recording setup, audience development strategies, any other topic that kind of comes to mind from our experience and also just from the community. And on the QR code, if you want to, if you scan that, you're going to get to where you can subscribe to our newsletter. So they'll be sharing additional podcast resources, updates on the Word on Campus podcast, and then information on this podcast network, which we're currently developing that covers a whole range of topics concerning education. So with that, thanks so much. And let's see, any questions? Rin-rin, thanks again. And everybody, thank you for tuning in.
Thank you.